Good evening, dear listeners. In these precarious times of hostilities and general unrest, the authorities have taken measures to identify those media elements who are responsible for the dissemination of hatred and subversion of the most perfidious kind, and decided to support them in their efforts to undermine all that is fair and just on this good earth. Well, as you may notice, it's not the Kurt Sense speaking to you, but one of his colleagues from the German YouTube scene. Schattenmacher, or Shadowmaker, how the people of Albion would translate it, is my name. I have a channel of about 50,000 subscribers and usually all my content is published exclusively in German. But today I am partnering up with our friend the Kurt Sense to discuss Alfonso Cuarón's 2006 dystopian film Children of Men. Both of us felt that there is a lot to say about this movie far beyond the boundaries of its own immediate plot, and so each of us devised his personal interpretation. We will give a short summary for those of you unfamiliar with the content, and then the Kurt Sense will proceed to outline the analogies between the movie themes and current world politics, while I will focus on a meta-level discussion and try to contextualize the narrative choices of the movie, especially with regard to the history of the 2000s, which I, born a dirty millennial, indeed experienced firsthand.
Children of Men was originally a book written by P.D. James. However, its movie adaptation, directed by Alfonso Cuarón, deviates greatly from both the story and the themes of the book, since the director never really read the original. He liked the synopsis and decided to use it as the base of a story that he wanted to tell. Cuarón's movies are as focused on the environment as they are on the characters themselves. Often enough, the camera will become distracted and look away from the protagonist to focus on the sights and events around them. I admit it, I am a sucker for atmospheric fiction, especially the depressing kind, and this world is depressing, and this goes way beyond the color palette, the music, and, well, England. The film depicts a world that is in crisis, or perhaps post-crisis would be closer to the core of Children of Men. The apocalypse has already happened, and even in Britain, the last place where there still is a semblance of normalcy, of law and order, the indications that the world has ended are ever present. The film is set in 2027. The first thing you see is a news report about the murder of the youngest person in the world, an 18-year-old in Argentina who was born in 2009. Since then, for no clear reason, the entire population of the world has been rendered infertile. And despite all their efforts, scientists have not been able to find a way out, or even an explanation. In one scene, a newspaper clipping in the background alludes to these attempts to solve the crisis. The headline reads, "Test Tube Daisy Dies." In fact, the lore of this world, the signs of the apocalypse, are to be found primarily in the background, in old newspaper clippings posted to the walls, in animated propaganda billboards, and in offhanded small talk. As a result of infertility and the eventual extinction of humans, people have stopped caring about the future. During most of the scenes in cities, one can see trash piling up on the pavement, and in the countryside, there are several wide shots of the scenery that show industrial pollution and pits of dead cows being incinerated as the protagonists drive by. Government ads promote quietus, a drug that provides a painless suicide, and bliss, a pill that promises happiness for all. However, this nothing to lose mindset is found primarily in violence and social collapse. With the exception of Britain, the entire world has fallen into anarchy and war. We do not see this in the film. We are made aware of it through the refugees that we see throughout the film. They speak Arabic and Ukrainian, but also languages that we rarely associate with refugees, such as German and Italian. In the background of many scenes we see headlines like "Explosion at Cafe leaves 12 dead," Day 1000 of the Siege of Seattle, 100 refugees found dead in a container, and Russian nuclear attack, Kazakhstan destroyed. These are spliced in with mundane headlines such as "Arsenal wins Champions League." Britain has endured in this chaotic world only because it has become a militarized police state which hunts down immigrants. Even these methods are barely enough to contain the entropy that threatens to tip the state into anarchy. On the other side, we have the Fishes, who are an organized guerrilla movement and are at war with the British government, and claim to fight for the rights of immigrants. They use bombings and kidnappings to achieve their goals, and they expect that soon a popular revolt, known as the Uprising, will topple the government.
The plot is pretty simple. The disillusioned main character Theo is asked by his estranged wife and mother of their dead child Julian to make use of his government contacts in order to get some papers for a black refugee named Key. In exchange for money, he agrees to organize the documents and, together with some members of the militant resistance group called the Fishes, he escorts Key through a country in open decay. On their way, they get attacked by motorized outlaws, which Julian, head of the Fishes, does not survive. Shortly after, it becomes clear that the ambush was orchestrated by a faction within the resistance group in order to install the radical Luke as its new leader. It is revealed that Key is pregnant and that the group seeks to exploit this miracle for their political aims. Theo and a midwife convince Key to flee with them. They escape the stronghold of the Fishes to a secret cabin in the woods, inhabited by Theo's hippie boomer friend, former political cartoonist, and by far my least favorite character Jasper, and his catatonic journalist wife Janice. The movie suggests that her retarded mental state is the consequence of government torture, but personally, I tend to think that not all of God's punishments are unjust. Anyway, Jasper arranges a meeting with pot customer and corrupt policeman Sid in order to smuggle Key through a detention camp to a nearby port where she is supposed to meet with the last remaining research team that is dedicated to fight the infertility crisis, but whose very existence remains dubious throughout the film. The group is still chased by the Fishes, who manage to locate the position of Jasper's house right before Key and Theo can leave the place. Jasper stays back to buy them some time, euthanizes his wife and dog with a government-sponsored suicide kit, and finally gets himself shot by Luke. It wasn't all bad with the communists, you know? In the confines of the refugee camp, Key gives birth to her baby, while a war breaks out between government troops and detainees led by fish activists. Sid tries to capture them for the bounty on their heads, but gets overwhelmed with the help of a Romani woman. Amidst the battles, Theo gets shot but not killed instantly by Luke, who is in turn blown up by a grenade. During a short ceasefire sparked by the general amazement about the tone and sight of a crying baby, Key and the injured Theo escape to a rowing boat. While the refugee camp is obliterated by an airstrike, well, it wasn't all bad with the fascists, you know, Key reveals that she will name her son after Theo's dead child. He smiles, he dies, she cries. The researchers actually do exist and pick mother and child up. The end. So what then are the political themes of this film?
The ever-present feeling in England in the year 2027 is that of utter despair. This molds the characters and directs their motivations, but it also defines the politics of both the British government and the Fishes. The question that this essay wants to answer is this: how does social despair give shape to politics both in Children of Men and in real-life political discourse? But the first thing that we must do is to define what despair even is. Despair is the opposite of hope, and hope is the belief that things will get better, and that life will somehow go on. Despair is the state where a person or a society believes the future will be worse than the present, and that there is no way to change this. There is a Greek proverb that goes like this, quote, "A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they know they shall never sit in." End quote. In order for the old men of today to plant the trees of tomorrow, they need to have hope. They need to believe that they can make the world better for the next generations. However, as you have noticed by now, the core concept of Children of Men is that there will be no next generations, and that in a couple of decades humanity will be extinct. Every monument that we have ever built will crumble. Every book that we have ever written will turn to dust. And every memory will soon be forgotten. In terms of politics, despair erodes the idealism inside a movement. The idealist is by nature hopeful. He believes that he can create a bright future if only we do the right thing. But when there is no future, there can be no idealism. and this has severe political consequences, which are portrayed in the film. All effective political movements have an internal balance between their idealism and their cynicism. This allows a movement to hold a righteous appearance while also rewarding the loyalty of their members. For example, the communists of the Russian Revolution expressed their utopian idealism in their propaganda, while on the other hand, they also gave their comrades the permission to kill and confiscate the property of the aristocrats for themselves. This balance allowed them to recruit young idealists who were eager to achieve communism, while also rewarding their supporters with the palaces of the former aristocracy, with positions of power, and with the pleasure of justified violence. If a movement loses its idealism, it will become a purely mercenary force which only cares for its own immediate desires. Some South American dictatorships have come close to this. On the other hand, a purely idealistic movement, which offers no cynical gratification to its followers, will never reach popularity. Ideals can only mobilize a few people, especially when the movement offers no benefits in return for years of dedication. The interesting thing about the politics of Children of Men is that in this world, the political movements that we are familiar with find themselves in a position of utter despair. Therefore, they lose all their idealism, and this violently brings out the worst aspects of both the left and the right. So let's begin with the left-wing fishes. This is how they describe themselves.
You are under the jurisdiction of the fishes. The fishes are at war with the British government until they recognize equal rights for every immigrant in Britain.
In most films, the rebels are typically the default good guys fighting against the evil government, and for a little, it seems that the fishes are going to fit into this cliché. At the beginning of the film, their idealism is still alive with Julian, who advocates for peaceful methods against the wishes of her fellow partisans. However, this idealism dies when she is assassinated in an internal coup, which installs the firebrand Luke as the leader of the fishes. The interesting thing about the fishes under the leadership of Luke is that they don't really seem to care much about the refugees around them, or the baby for that matter. In the climax of the film, they show utter disregard for the lives of the refugees at Bexhill. Their rebellion leads to the brutality of urban warfare, with the refugees caught in the crossfire. The indifference is absolute, as they don't even flinch when they see the refugees around them being gunned down, and in fact, they even kill some themselves when they shoot at Theo. One would imagine that if the fishes were actually motivated by the well-being of the refugees, they would try to avoid harming them, and using their houses as barricades, especially when facing an enemy with superior firepower and little care for civilian casualties. They claim to care about Kia and her baby, but at the same time they also don't seem to mind that their actions put the baby in the middle of a fucking battlefield. So if the fishes are not motivated by the well-being of refugees, or by protecting Kia and her baby, then what moves them? Of course, now we move into speculation, but I believe that one can observe what they really care about from this piece of dialogue.
What were you thinking? What was I thinking? You realize you're putting the uprising in jeopardy. But he needs a proper doctor. Don't you get it? We have a baby. When people see we have a baby, everyone will join us in the uprising.
Simon's a good fish, so are you. Be proud to know that because of the two of you, the uprising is assured. The baby will stay with us.
It's clear that what Luke and the fishes most want is the uprising at all costs. But why? What does the uprising represent in the minds of the fishes? The uprising represents the fall of the tyrannical government which has wronged them. At first glance, this might seem like something positive for the refugees. However, one has to take into account that the tyrannical government is the precise reason why Britain has not fallen into anarchy like the rest of the world. Therefore, the uprising would result in the same anarchy from which the refugees are fleeing. Why then does Luke want the uprising so badly? The key to understanding his character is to understand that he has been completely consumed by despair. He has no idealism left, and so his immediate desires guide him. But which of all of these desires reigns supreme? We have all heard of this thought experiment. The world will end in 24 hours and nothing can stop it. What do you do then in this scenario? Since nothing matters, why should you not do what you always have wanted to do? Some would drug themselves, others would confess their love, but those who have lived a lifetime of abuse, those who were too afraid to do something before, there is only one burning impulse for them, and that is revenge, for they have nothing left to lose. This is Luke. All that keeps him going is his desire for revenge, which consumes him. He has given into despair, and he believes that humans will soon become extinct and that there is no hope left. And so he decides to lash out against the state that has put thousands of desperate refugees in cages and hunts down his own comrades. Consequences be damned. Therefore, anything can be justified in the name of the uprising, including bombing coffee shops, causing the deaths of thousands of refugees, and potentially killing the only baby in the world before it is a day old. The uprising is a last slap in the face, a final fuck you, the ultimate act of revenge against their oppressors. The film provides an immersive world with fascinating political dynamics. But the burning question here is, how much of this applies to our world and to our politics? In many ways, the politics of Children of Men are an exaggeration of the real world. But I do believe that the aspects that it exaggerates are very much real. Resentment and revenge are very much present in today's left-wing politics, just like class privilege and xenophobia are present in right-wing discourse. But the question here is to what extent this is the case. How much of current politics are driven by idealism as opposed to despair? Today, the political left contains many factions such as the old left Marxists and the new left hippies, as well as diverse sexual and ethnic minorities. However, in my opinion, the most influential faction in the modern left, and the one that correlates most closely with the fishes, is what we could call the third worldist left. I would define this group as the section of the left which conceptualizes the countries of the first world as the oppressors and the poor countries of the third world as the oppressed, as opposed to the classical Marxist proletariat bourgeoisie dynamic, although there is some overlap. The third worldists are generally in favor of immigration and decolonization, while opposing neocolonialism and foreign interventions. Thus, the question, are today's third worldists motivated by empathy or by cynical, burning resentment? This can only be answered by looking at their priorities, at the things that interest them the most. If idealism is stronger today, their interest would be focused on improving the lives of the poor and oppressed in the third world, and on the other hand, if they are motivated primarily by resentment, one should observe they are ambivalent to the suffering of the third world while only caring about the destruction of the first. Now, the 21st century has not been a very good time for the third world, especially in Africa and in the Middle East. Sudan is in the middle of a gigantic civil war and famine with an estimated death toll of 150,000 to 500,000. The Gaza war has claimed more than 60,000 lives. In the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda is using a proxy militia to exploit the rich mineral resources of the area. The Yemeni civil war and famine have led to around 377,000 deaths, plus the civil wars in Myanmar, in Somalia, and Libya and Syria, not to mention the myriad of other problems with overpopulation, dictatorship, and corruption across the global south. However, the interesting thing is that the third worldist crowd, and the left in general, gives most of these crises and wars very little attention. In fact, when researching this, I even found some ongoing famines that I had never heard about, such as in Tigray province, Ethiopia, with over 200,000 deaths. One can say that both the media and the third worldists are generally silent when it comes to the suffering of the third world. However, this isn't really true, is it? Because there's one big exception to this rule. The left devotes almost their entire attention and empathy to the suffering caused by one conflict in particular, that is the war in Gaza. This conflict and the recent famine have motivated protests all around the world. It receives daily news coverage and attention in social media. But why is this? And why does this not happen with other conflicts such as the war in Sudan? Certainly, if we asked a person in a Western pro-Palestine protest if she values the life of a Palestinian child more than that of a Sudanese one, she would surely say no. But why then does this person give hundreds of times more attention to the former as opposed to the latter? I believe that this is the key question that allows us to see into the real motivation of third worldism. This abysmal disparity in empathy shows that the mere suffering of the third world cannot be what motivates them. There must be something else. There must be something about Gaza that Sudan, Yemen, and Myanmar do not have. However, I think that the difference is a bit obvious. There is no one to root for in Sudan. This brutal civil war is a fight between a barbaric military dictatorship and a slightly more barbaric military dictatorship. Meanwhile, the Gaza war provides a narrative that is crack for third worldism. After all, a good narrative is ultimately what drives people into the streets to protest for something that does not directly affect them. But if it's all about the narrative, what about Myanmar? There you have a very attractive narrative. You have a Burmese supremacist, racist military dictatorship fighting an alliance of ethnic minorities and a pro-democracy movement led by a woman no less, and yet no dice. This is the perfect narrative to get people to protest, and yet no one does. Again, what does the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have that neither Myanmar nor Sudan has? Well, Israelis. Third worldism cares only about Gaza because Israel is involved, and not because anti-Semitism, as some paranoid Jews might think. Instead, it's because leftists in general see Israel as a white Western racist colonial state which oppresses the brown, indigenous, poor Palestinians with American imperialist military support, no less. If Gaza were being flattened by Egypt, the left, and the world in general, would not give a shit. Very much like they did not care when Saddam Hussein decided to gas the Kurds, and how they still do not care when Sudan tears itself apart. But the fact that it's Israel doing it with American-provided firepower means that it fits neatly into the century-old narrative of anti-colonialism. Any person from a non-white minority or a former colony can easily identify with the oppression of the Palestinians by the imperialist white man and join the coalition, or the resistance, or whatever. For example, this explains the energetic pro-Palestine activism of Sohra Mamdani, who was born in Uganda to Indian parents. The only other recent war that has attracted similar amounts of third worldist attention is the United States invasion of Iraq, because it also fits with this exact narrative of the white man oppressing the Arabs for their oil. When one looks at the actions and cares of third worldists, one can conclude that they are principally driven by resentment against the first world and not for love of the third. That they care much more about the uprising than the refugees, to bring it back to Children of Men. And it is not really something that they hide. It does not take a lot of scrolling to find such confessions on Twitter. For example, here are two screenshots from the communist YouTuber or third worldist YouTuber Bad Empanada. Notice that every single tweet expresses some desire to punish or to cause suffering to either the US, Israel, and apparently Singapore. And although idealism is still half alive in other factions of the political left, such as the working class Marxists and the New Age hippies, one can easily conclude that what lies at the heart of most third worldist discourse is despair. They believe that there is no hope or solution to the suffering of the third world. They are driven by resentment and wish to burn down Israel, the US, and the West as a whole for their misdeeds, even if the third world burns as well.
In my opinion, this characterization of left-wing political movements as highly idealistic organizations but devoid of a concrete and presentable ideology dates back far beyond the current political frame and even predates the 2000s, when this movie was made, by some decades. The Fishes are ideologically speaking in a similar situation as was the late Red Army fraction, the infamous German terror organization. After their heydays in the 70s, when there was still a relatively concrete Marxist materialist or Leninist Maoist revolutionary analysis to society traceable in their published manifestos, this organization became more progressive and less spectacularly violent until they finally resolved in the 90s. Their last publication is characterized by expressed feelings of pointlessness, of having reached the end of history and no concrete ideology left to refer to. The people who wrote the script for Children of Men are faced with similar challenges. They wanted to take a nuanced stance regarding the ambiguous morality of radical and supposedly humanitarian organizations like the Fishes, but they failed to imagine realistic and intellectually sophisticated motives and worldviews for their antagonists. Just as the RAF in the 90s could not come up with reasons to reinvigorate and justify their militant attitudes, so were the screenwriters not able to do the same for the activists in their movies. Like any other movie, they were able to claim violence and certain actions, but they were not able to integrate such deeds into a believable grand goal. Global disappropriation of the capitalist owner class to build an utopian world society of equals constitutes a concrete goal, which is very hard to realize but easy to propagandize, at least for some time, before the first results come in. Revenge on the first world and enjoyment in the torment of white people is also a pretty concrete goal, and comprehensible on a psychological level, but taken in isolation it lacks the moral high ground and intellectual catharsis. The latter rather resembles a strawman version of extreme right-wing ideologies than any idea of the humanistic or socialistic betterment of society. In the 2000s, all grand political visions were dead. They were in fact dead to such a degree that even movie makers who are free to construct the environments for their works at will were struggling to come up with something robust. Luke and the Fishes are not just desperately fighting against the government for reasons never fully revealed, because in their world all feeling of purpose has been eradicated by total human infertility, but also because even without these narrative constructions, in the 2000s it had become utterly impossible to formulate a worldview that was strong enough to fight and die for, but also realistic and concrete enough to believe in it. Humanity had indeed become drastically infertile. Not so much on a biological level, although it's not looking so rosy there either, but on an ideological level. There were no children of mind anymore, so to say. Up to the current day, the world has still not recovered from this crisis. Sure, the circumstances have become less comfortable. The power of factual reality has injected some portion of adrenaline into the political carcass. But just because people have become somewhat more itchy and agitated does not mean that they have left the vacuum of visions in the 2000s, and this holds true not only for left-wing movements.
But now let's return to the world of Children of Men and talk about the right-wing government. England is a total police state. Right from the first scenes onward, they are ever present. However, the most revealing scene is when Theo goes to meet his cousin, Nigel, who is the Minister of the Ark of the Arts, an organization dedicated to saving the artworks of the collapsing world before they are destroyed. He begins his journey, driven in a Rolls-Royce, through a third-worldish grey-tinged part of London. Remember, this used to be fiction. Then he passes through a heavily militarized checkpoint on the other side, and we see a haven, an idyllic green park illuminated by sunlight, where well-dressed aristocrats stroll with exotic animals while they enjoy live orchestral music. One could almost forget that this is an apocalyptic movie. Finally, he arrives at Battersea Power Plant where his cousin lives. As he comes in, he sees the statue of David with a broken leg. Nigel comments,
"Couldn't save La Pietà. Smashed up before we got there."
Theo later has dinner with Nigel and his son, who appears to be only interested in a holographic video game. Picasso's Guernica adorns the dining room. After the servants clear away the plates, Theo asks his cousin the following.
What? You kill me. 100 years from now, there won't be one sad fuck to look at any of this. What keeps you going?
You know what it is, Theo? I just don't think about it.
I think that this dialogue is the key to understanding the actions of the government. The British state proclaims that it acts to maintain law and order and to protect its own population. However, at the same time, they market painless suicide drugs to this very same population. Not to mention that their military forces seem to be as concerned with keeping the poor out of their beautiful parks as they are in keeping the refugees out of the country. It seems to me that the British government has also given into despair, and that under the mask of the ideals of law and order, there is another deep desire, namely the desire to not think about it. The government's true mission is to provide bliss to the privileged, and to protect this wonderful illusion from the anarchy that threatens to shatter it. In a world that is ending, the opportunity of enjoying the rest of your life without worry and scarcity is the greatest luxury. This is something that is also profoundly human. It is an attempt to avoid the suffering of the world. And in a world like that of Children of Men, who can blame Nigel for not trying to think about it? However, to hold up this privilege, one necessarily needs the guns and the tanks of the police and the army, for without them, one could not create a haven without suffering in such a chaotic world. But since the police and the army are barely managing to hold anarchy at bay, they have resorted to the most brutal methods to stop the collapse of the state. Ensuring order with an iron fist is the result of the desperate situation that the government finds itself in. However, this does not mean that the men who carry out this violence are not enjoying it. Throughout the film, we can observe that the police and the army thoroughly enjoy the power that they hold over the desperate refugees which are flooding into their country. The character which best reflects this is Sid, the policeman who speaks in third person. He is perhaps the most interesting character of the film because one could argue that he is the most nihilistic. He is completely disconnected from any ideals and is without mission beyond his own benefit and enjoyment. He is a policeman who smokes weed. He is a border guard who smuggles people. Even when he sees Key holding the first baby born in 18 years, he thinks only of the great reward that he will receive for catching such a unique prize. He, like the other soldiers and policemen, has been thoroughly poisoned by despair. When nothing matters and the world is going to end, why not enjoy your time here? Being a policeman certainly has its perks. First and foremost, power. Every person in a position of authority gets off on this, from the bureaucrat at the DMV to a head of state. But there is no power more intoxicating than the power of life and death over another person. No pleasure more noxious than the capacity to hurt. This certainly is a very taboo topic. In our day-to-day lives, we rarely acknowledge the very real existence of sadism, of the fact that violence is very pleasurable. But the issue is that spoken or unspoken, this is a human constant. Despite our over-socialization, most people still live out their violent fantasies vicariously through action movies and sports. But once in a while, every person is going to find themselves in a situation where they have the capacity to hurt another and get away with it. This fundamental fact underlies the interactions in our workplaces, in our politics, and also often in our families. The reason why violence feels so good beyond its Darwinian implications is that everyone is well acquainted with the feeling of powerlessness. As children, we are powerless and completely dependent on adults, and as adults, we are not much better off. Most people are employees of another person, and we all have to follow laws and social norms that we did not create. Therefore, violence feels good because it makes us feel powerful. It distances us from the very familiar feeling of powerlessness, of impotence. To quote Joseph de Maistre, quote, "Man is insatiable for power. He is infantile in his desires and always disconcerted with what he has, loves only what he has not. People complain of the despotism of princes. They ought to complain of the despotism of man. We are all born despots, from the most absolute monarch in Asia to the infant who smothers a bird in its hand for the pleasure of seeing something that exists in this world which is weaker than itself." End quote. So, the price for the green parks of London is the red blood that the police must spill. Although Nigel and Sid are completely contradictory characters, they still are both locked in a symbiotic relationship. Sid bashes skulls to maintain the stability of the state, and Nigel provides Sid with the equipment and the justification to do so. So, coming back to the real world, how much has despair affected the conservative movements around the West and pushed them towards what we see in the characters of Nigel and Sid? Perhaps the answer to this question can be found by observing the priorities of current conservative governments. An idealistic conservative loves his country and will attempt to resolve the problems that his country is facing, while one that is cynical will prefer to not think about it. Logically, he will attempt to ignore and postpone the pressing issues of the age for the sake of his tranquility. And so, we must ask ourselves, are conservatives today interested in fixing the burning issues of our age, or are they more interested in nothing beyond their comfort and career? The first burning issue is actually the simplest, that is debt. Most countries around the world are acquiring debt at a far faster rate than they are growing their economies. As of today, the United States has a debt of a bit more than $37.5 trillion US dollars, around 123% of its current nominal GDP. This number keeps growing at an alarming rate. Alarming if I were American, that is. Are US conservatives truly concerned with this state of affairs? Well, some of them are. The Trump administration has taken mostly symbolic measures to reduce the deficit of now over 2 trillion USD per year, but the deficit keeps rising. This is even more concerning in other countries, such as in Japan. Their conservative government, which has been in power for 70 out of the 73 years since the end of the US occupation, has also overseen the stagnation of their economy and the inflation of its debt to over 250% of their GDP. There are many other countries racking up debt, but so far, nowhere has there been a concerted effort to cut spending and raise taxes to not have a deficit, because this is political suicide. Better to leave the problem to the next administration. The other key issue is demographics. No first world country has enough children to prevent a future population collapse, but some are worse than others. In fact, the TFR of South Korea today, which is 0.7, is much closer to the birth rate in children of men, 0.0, than to the replacement rate of 2.1. This is not a new phenomenon. Infertility has been a clear problem in most countries since the 70s. The consequences of demographic decline are as obvious as water wetting and fire burning. After all, it's only arithmetic. Have the European conservatives, like the Conservative Party in the UK or the German CDU, taken this problem as an existential threat? Have they taken measures to fix this burning issue? Again, the answer is a half-hearted yes. Many conservative governments have attempted to give money to parents to have more children. Others have imported millions of immigrants to make up for the population deficit. However, the issue of what is causing infertility is far too complex, and its consequences far too far away for the current politicians of today to engage with this topic, so why bother? But if we were to sit down and have an honest heart-to-heart conversation with these conservative politicians, and we would ask them how they manage to sleep at night knowing that these current problems are becoming worse and worse, they might just quote Nigel and say that they don't think about it. When it comes to the police and the army, I do not believe that today they act in a completely nihilistic way as portrayed in the film, mainly because the state today does not yet need to crack skulls to maintain order. In most Western countries, the police barely have to use force in order to keep the peace, with the exceptions of a couple troublesome neighborhoods. This does not mean that there are no policemen that cynically enjoy their authority and the capacity to exert violence against others in the name of the law, but simply that these opportunities are few and far between because the government can afford to use softer methods, and because there are only a few situations where the policeman can really get away with naked brutality. These types of policemen are most prevalent where real violence is often required to keep the peace, such as in large crime-ridden cities. There will be a lot more SIDS in the Chicago Police Department as compared to the donut and coffee officers of Martha's Vineyard. The simple reality is that most cops do believe that they are acting in the service of their societies and keeping the peace. Thus, despair is not really universal. Indeed, I do believe that the amount of idealism in law enforcement is directly correlated with how difficult it is to bribe a police officer. If you really want to see how cynicism in the police looks like, you should travel to Latin America.
Again, although I do believe that let's not think about it too hard is, as described, indeed often the default of the current establishment ruling class and also the preferred mode of thinking for many old guard conservatives. The lack of coherency regarding the depicted and supposedly fascist government in the movie is also a symptom of its time of origin. The 2000s were a time where the general understanding of actual political processes probably reached its all-time low since the inception of the democratic age some few hundred years ago. Long gone were the days of competing ideological systems during which actual attempts of understanding the true nature of human political relations, be they materialistic, Darwinistic, or elite-dominated, were undertaken. The man of the 2000s most often did not care or could not imagine, and when he was forced to care or to imagine, he hastily reproduced the shallow self-descriptions of the liberal democratic order without ever attempting to examine the situation on his own. The result is naturally a generation of writers that largely fails to construct understandable political motivations, especially if they are quote-unquote evil. I mean, why is the government in the movie so nasty towards immigrants? The fact that all these extreme governmental measures shown in the film are never connected to any explicit reasoning is not an accident. As far as I'm informed, in the original novel that laid the groundwork for the movie, migrants are lured into Great Britain to work there when they are young and thrown out when they are old and economically useless. A simple scheme, maybe heartless, but intellectually sound. In the movie, the national government of the British Isles has decided to get rid of all migrants and foreigners seemingly on principle, and it puts so much emphasis on this goal that it is willing to force these undesirable elements into ghettos and facilities that do remind the viewer of concentration camps. It is also quite surprising and never really revealed how it can uphold such an effective and loyal fighting force. Their soldiers at least never seem to reconsider putting their life and muscle on the line of a totally doomed project. Well, I guess some people prefer crawling through mud, ditching bullets instead of staying at home and spending the last days of humanity with some significant other. And don't get me wrong, I'm not some libtard who could never understand the honor of servitude or following through with an order to the bitter end. But it takes a certain kind of society and leadership and end goal to evoke such behavior, and we never see any of it in the movie. Rather, after watching the entire film, we still have no real clue why such tremendously brutal efforts are even being undertaken. I guess migrants are on average more criminal and disorderly than the British population, economically less capable, often even a burden on the welfare state, a massive threat to the cultural homogeneity and heritage of the host nation, and finally a destructive element regarding the demographic dynamics of a country. All valid points that could be considered, although the writers would of course never dare to. But who in their right mind would prioritize or even care at all about any of this, if the literal extinction of all of humanity by failure of procreation is imminent? Why are they so mean? Or why are they not mean enough? Why care for migrants when more important things are on the schedule? Or why not outright shoot them all on the spot if nothing matters anyway? The answer is of course that writers felt that an evil government does not require any reason to be evil. Fascism and racism, trademark, are evil incarnate, and to ask questions in their presence is itself a sacrilege. Right up to the current day, almost all movies suffer from this syndrome. An intellectual or rational groundwork for why someone or something is fascist or racist is never presented, especially not beyond personal or anecdotal reasons, because if it were, one would have to admit that the fascist racist evildoers may have a legitimate point to their actions and are thus not evil incarnate anymore. All governments are somewhat right-wing, or right-wing action is somewhat evil. If the circumstances get dire, this becomes somewhat extreme. End of story. That is the political theory of Alfonso Cuarón in Children of Men, and it was in general the gold standard of thinking during the 2000s. All the creativity and all the artistic talent that was put into this movie or any mainstream movie of that era would only focus on the dire circumstances and how they came to be, but they would seldom challenge the other axioms, would seldom develop a true theory of the human political condition. Sure, one could make the point that the absent reasoning for why and how the government exactly acts the way it does contributes to the feelings of purposelessness and despair, and thus somewhat supports the themes of the movie. But make no mistake, in this case, art imitated life. And there is another instance where it did so. Finally, I want to elaborate on my intense dislike of Jasper, the political cartoonist, the husband of a tortured journalist wife, the Ruby Tuesday listening, pot smoking, government criticizing boomer wastrel of a man. Well, first things first. The screenwriters and Michael Caine did a good job designing and portraying the figure of Jasper. They touched on something real, something that possesses an unholy resemblance to an existing generational type of man. Jasper is real, or better, he is derived from something that is real but deserves far less sympathy than the movie version. Let's start with his profession. He is a political cartoonist, and if you keep track of this kind of social commentator, especially in that age bracket, you will with quite some likelihood meet a man who spends all his energy pretending to distance himself from institutions of power that he scorns as right-wing, no matter how crazy left-wing they are, while at the same time would never in 1,000 years publish anything about that girl down his street that was gang raped by a group of migrants last week. He is no political observer at all, because all of his conclusions and opinions, most often some soft 60s version of hypocritical liberal humanism, are a priori set in stone and never see any correction. In this regard, the Jasperoids of this world are not so different from their less sophisticated generational brethren. What are the headlines we find displayed in his house? Don't attack Iraq, war is not the answer, Jasper Palmer questions Britain's ethical response to the refugee situation. Sounds familiar? Yeah. In the world of Children of Men, that is, the world that Alfonso Cuarón thought somewhat possible and believable, Jasper is an independent individualist fighting all kinds of oppression. But in our world, 20 years later, his independent individualism has been put to the test, and it failed miserably. They all go with the government, because the government is not made up of fascists, but broadly speaking of people that underwent a socialization not so different from the one that produced Jasper. In more than one way, Cuarón, reproducing the common wisdom of his time, predicted the exact opposite of what would actually happen in his near future. The government would love the fugees, would let them all in, and the Jaspers would pot-smokingly applaud it, never to be concerned with any of the consequences. Until maybe some of these consequences would knock directly on their door. The most relevant threat to political cartoonists in the Western world is obviously radical Islam. The attacks on Charlie Hebdo in the year 2015 come to mind. Some people will be inclined to depict these events as some form of vindication of the political cartoonist class, since, with all due respect, they did not fully back down and republished the Mohammed caricatures around the time the Islamist terrorists responsible for the attacks were tried in court, just as Jasper did not bow to the deadly pressure of the fishes. But these noble glimmers of bravery aside, what have they achieved, Jasper and the cartoonists of this world? Who have they convinced that the war is not the answer? What change for the better have they caused? The Islamists were neither stopped nor impressed by satire or calls to peace, angered maybe, as was the government in Children of Men by the photojournalism of Jasper's wife. The force that stopped them in the end was either the police and the military, the antithesis to war is not the answer, or nothing at all, and violence continued unimpeded. Yeah, you wrote your satire, and then fascism came around the corner and pulled out its long knife. And then what? To be perfectly clear, I do not condemn the Jaspers of the world, real or hypothetical, for drawing cartoons, or for not single-handedly turning the tide of history or something. But after your wife gets tortured into a catatonic state, or your society tears itself apart as a consequence of the ideologies that you at least implicitly supported, maybe it becomes time to lay down that joint and rethink your approach to life. And I don't think Jasper has done that. He strikes me as the kind of character that would look around at the end of all things, convinced that he was always on the right side of history and everybody else just didn't get it. It's a nice epitaph. Alas, not just for yourself. I know I went a bit off the rails with this one, but one of the things I remember most lively from the 2000s was Jasper's brand of jovial, ineffective self-righteousness. And back then, when there was no real platform to counter-signal it and societal evidence of its failure was still weak, especially in Europe, you just had to sit there and take it. Well, I can't say things have gotten any better since then, but I think it is at least obvious now that hippie boomerism is not the solution to society's problems, and whatever the future might hold for us, in all the time that is yet to come, we should aspire to something that is maybe a little more fierce.
I think that it is clear today that both the left and the right have a strong sense of despair eating away at their idealism. It is not as extreme as in Children of Men, but it is there, and it is growing. This increase comes from the fact that today most people have stopped believing in the idea that things will continue to get better and better, and that we live in the blessed end of history. This is especially prevalent with young people. Most boomers continue with their insufferable optimism, but the youth of the right is pessimistic due to birth rates, migration, and social decadence, while the leftist youth is pessimistic because of global warming, growing inequality, and the rise of nationalism in their countries. As this despair mounts, it should be expected that politics moves towards resentment and denial, and less towards actually fixing things, because you need a little bit of hope to do that. But what conclusion do we carry home? Should we just accept that as things get worse and more people lose hope, politics will simply become increasingly cynical in a downward spiral? That is certainly part of it. I do believe that this pattern will play itself out before our very eyes in the next 20 years. But at the same time, no one wants to be trapped in this. As long as man lives, he will yearn for hope, especially in times of despair. Is this not the true message of Children of Men? That one can find hope in the depths of despair? But how can both a society and an individual find hope when things are getting worse? How can one bring idealism back from the dead? The only way to revive idealism, as the name implies, is with ideals. However, the precise difficulty is that social despair entails that the ideals of a society have already crumbled. Therefore, the only way to have ideals is to make them ourselves, because we cannot get them from passive osmosis. The only way not to fall into despair today is to believe in something new. I believe that the only way to escape the downward spiral of cynical politics is to regain hope through belief in new ideals, and I predict that the human need for idealism will drive the creation of new ideologies that will give people hope once more, that will promise to deal with the problems of the 21st century instead of just ignoring them. Life has not existed for millions of years because there are organisms with a million-year lifespan, but because life is locked in a cycle of regeneration where the old die and the young take their place, until in turn they wither away to be replaced by the next cohort. Why should we expect ideas and beliefs to be static and timeless when everything else living is dynamic and transient? Old ideals also die, and you and me, my dear listener, are going to watch them die in agony and despair. In the world of Children of Men, this is final. The old die, and the new don't take their place because the cycle has stopped. But in our world, despair is not final, because life goes ever on. Transient, chaotic, cruel, beautiful.